Welcome to The People I Play With. This is the show where I interview, well, the people I play with. I'm your host, Jesse Bernico. Today's guest is James Ritter. So the last time James was on, we talked about Blade Runner. And to continue on that theme, we're going to talk about another much darker crime game. The Hour Between Dog and Wolf is a two-player game about a detective pursuing a serial killer. You played the detective, and I played the serial killer. Now, the detective has three stats: obsession, stability, and conscience. And right out of the gate, you maxed out Detective Finney's obsession. And all I can say is, why, James? Why?
You wanted to play this game particularly with me because I have an affinity for dysfunctional detective shows, and I wanted the detective to be dysfunctional. Typically, that genre, they're so obsessed with their job that it destroys everything else in their lives. So I wanted to set that up from the get-go, that he's fully obsessed with career, and it's already impacting his life. I was interested to see what that did to the game.
You'd also written in a past failure into the character's backstory that there was some other case that he either didn't solve or had bungled really badly.
Yeah, I mean, that's also like a trope, that there's some history that comes out during the course of the events that, you're the exact wrong person to be on the case, or the public loses faith in you and you lose faith in yourself too. You have to wrestle with inner demons from your past failures.
In some ways, starting out of the gate with your obsession that high almost felt like it was the third book into a series, and you were just writing off the tragic ending of the second book.
I did front load the story there. He came in the middle of a downward cycle. We didn't see the origin story, but that happens a lot in this kind of dysfunctional detective stuff. You learn as you go, like, why this person is so consumed by the killer, and actually the story is more about the detective, finding themselves as opposed to like finding out who the killer is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and in fact, I was glad that the game wasn't just you collecting evidence and me killing people. There was a lot of personal development for both of our characters. There were a number of scenes involving Finney's personal life, his ex-wife, his kid. You even went fishing at one point. So tell me a little bit about your take on Finney's personal life and those moments.
Well, I think that's a failing of the RPG games in general around mysteries. They focus a lot on how do you get clues and what happens when you don't find something to the plot. Whereas that's often not the main focus when you're reading or watching something in this genre. It's not focused on, what's the next clue. The clue's coming. It's much more focused on what does that do to the players. And then when you see the killer, it also is all about exposing their personality. This game is really good at that. Right? It actually doesn't have any mechanism by which clues are known or clues are devised. It just says you get evidence and then you fill in a fictional background around that. Your evidence stack goes up, and then you decide, what does that mean in this scene? That way it was really meaty. It wasn't just a clue chain where you're going from clue 1 to clue 2. It was about scenes in these lives of these two people and how it impacted their lives.
It's sort of weird because in some ways, the games that do the best detective stories are absolutely not functional mysteries from a play perspective. It sort of frees you up. We're not solving this mystery as a puzzle. Therefore, we can have the scene where you're taking your kid to school and having an argument about your ex-wife because we're not obsessively trying to puzzle out what's going on.
Right. And then you can show up in a scene and it's not like you have to figure out how to save you for the climax, right? How does the big bad get away so that at the end of the story, that's when the big reveal happens? We didn't have those kind of worries as well. This game does not structure things around it being a mystery that the mechanics are going to solve, because they're about your compulsion going up, my obsession going up or down, stability increasing or decreasing. That's what the mechanics are determining.
You brought up an interesting point because our characters did meet once before the actual end of the game. It was on my turn in the game. I had framed a scene where I was actually meeting your ex-wife and your kid, and because my character was a math professor, I was offering tutoring lessons to your kid. And normally we don't appear in each other's scenes, but there's this mechanic where you can spend plot points, and it's expensive. You spent those 2 plot points real fast. Tell me a little bit about that particular moment and that tension, and why you like needed to jump into that. It was very interesting, and it was a very compelling moment.
I was generating quite a few plot points at that point. I never felt strangled for plot points. I felt the need to be present and to intervene and protect my NPC wife and child. It just seemed like a good moment for the cop to show up and there to be some kind of confrontation. My character at that point in our game had already broken into your house and rifled through your belongings. He would know who you were. But just not be able to prove what he suspected, which is the frustrating thing that happens in these detective stories as well, where you're like, that's the guy, I know it. And you're willing to break the law in order to try to get the goods. But the adversary is always smart. They're not easily captured. I couldn't expose you for who you were. I didn't have the mechanics for it, but it was a good interaction. It's pretty elegant the way it brings the backstory into the foreground and makes them important.
That's one of the things that I think I'm curious about. We had those personal scenes with your ex-wife and your kid, and a lot of those scenes mechanically will increase your other scores like conscience. Did you ever think about hitting those scenes more to potentially heal Finney, or was it always more justification for why his obsession is so high?
I think there was a point in time where I chose a scene type that would increase my stability if I succeeded, because you had rocked his stability and he was really unstable. And mechanically, it was making my life a little difficult and your life a little easier. We'd had a lot of scenes where things had been about his obsession. I don't remember the exact scene, but I did choose something that if I succeeded, stability would go up for a mechanical reason. But it fit. Like the game is flexible enough that whatever scene you choose fits into the ongoing story pretty well. You have that more than me, where you're like, I really can't justify a murder. I didn't have that concern, and you did. Partially because I think you set your compulsion low. So you were on a slow burn, and I was on a fast fireball to hell.
It's a thing that I found interesting about this game is that each player has this list of scenes to choose from, and I think mathematically they actually sort of parallel each other. But with only a couple of exceptions, there really aren't any constraints around which scene you can choose. If I had wanted to murder people all day long, I could have. If you had wanted to sit around your apartment brooding, you could have. But definitely, I got the sense that we did both feel a bit constrained by the developing fiction, and that these scenes in some ways kind of had to be earned. And I remember a distinct moment. You had thought about jumping into a crossing the line scene, and then you immediately backed off because you're like, oh no, 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 I'm not there yet. And then even later, when you did do a crossing the line scene by breaking into my house, I remember that there was this little discussion at the beginning about like, is that justified? Has enough fiction occurred to put the pieces together to go warrantless into your house? And I personally really enjoyed that commitment to the fictional integrity. I want to hear more about your process for selecting scenes.
So the game doesn't force you to do what you think best. If you want to do something you don't feel fits, the game won't say, well, you can't. But why then are you doing something if you don't feel like it fits? I always wonder when people ask those kind of questions. It's not stopping me from making a bad choice. I'm like, but you know that the choice is bad. Why are you making that choice? I didn't feel justified in the beginning that Finney, who I envisioned as, one of the many dysfunctional detectives that you see in these Netflix shows, he's not ready to break into somebody's house illegally. We haven't had that kind of tension yet. Partially, you hadn't done a lot of murders yet. The pressure wasn't on. He was much more pressured by the things that had gone wrong in his past. He was just now building, and it didn't feel like this would be the scene where you would have Finney break in. It's easy to say, I'm not feeling that. And the game doesn't disincentivize those kind of decisions either. Like whatever decision you think fits will work. It leaves you free to choose what you think's best, which is nice. Detective genre needs to build off of the tensions from the last scene into some kind of crescendo where the detective's inner life mirrors the outer life. That's kind of how these things go.
You said something about it feeling very mechanics driven, that you were looking at the numbers, and I'm wondering, do you feel you were doing that primarily, or do you feel there were certain scenes that you were grabbing because this just clearly follows from what you just did?
I mean, there's narrative here, right? But this game was definitely like your choices will have mechanical effects, and those mechanical effects, you can't get around them. But there was a definite story that emerged. We were following these two characters. There were things that they would do that made sense from the last thing that happened. So when you committed a murder, then I knew eventually there was going to be a scene where I'm investigating that body. Now, there might be a scene in between where I'm dealing with my wife or my child. And that also fits, right? Like the chronology was narratively loose so that we could bounce back and forth and do flashbacks and to make a decision that fit best the feeling. There was never a time where the two were in conflict. There were times when I made a narrative decision and then I would look down and see what's that going to do to the state of play. So there was no time where I said, oh, I can't do that because of a mechanical reason. When I decided not to do a scene, it was generally because of the narrative. Like it didn't fit, as opposed to that wouldn't be good for mechanics wise. As a killer, did it feel the same?
There are two places. One, there's a lot of things where I try to mess with you directly. And I really basically ignored those just on principle for a long period of time because I had no sense that my character uh knew that you were even onto them. And in at least one case, it even applied to an outcome because the one where I did mess with your family, it's an either or choice, and one of those choices is to score a victim. I don't even think it says it directly, but just looking at it, you're like, I kill your ex-wife, or this is where I kill your kid, and that was just off the table for him because he's not that guy. He's this math professor who's obsessed with finding the perfect student slash lover slash muse. He wants to throw you off your game, but he's not going to just slaughter your family members for no reason.
We weren't playing Seven.
So there were lots of places where there were mechanical options we just took off the table because no, that's not where we're at. No, it was only after you broke into my house without a warrant that opened the door for me to start doing those types of scenes, right? But I was waiting for a moment like that before selecting the scenes. So I find it interesting that for a game that it's so gamey in terms of like making your stats go up and down, like, how weighty the fiction is around those decisions.
Yeah, that's kind of the fruitful void. The game doesn't deal with the fictional choices directly. It doesn't force it's not like you roll on a dice, okay, you have to do a investigation scene. That choice is completely a free choice. That's a narrative choice.
The rules don't have any weird restrictions like, oh, you can only do this type of scene after two of those other scenes, or this scene must follow that scene. It's just the same menu every time.
Yeah. Theoretically, I could have done every scene an investigation scene. I don't know what it would have done, but the game was calling for other scenes, or the story was calling for other scenes. But it's not going to tell you, oh, you need to do this scene.
I really appreciated that about it.
Yeah, I think it's right.
So, do you have a question for me about this game that we played?
You chose a very low compulsion killer. Wondering about that choice. Why did you choose that? And did you feel frustrated by that choice ever? I was rolling with many more dice. Who gets the plot points is determined by who rolls highest. And since my obsession was higher, I tended to have more dice. And so I tended to win most of the plot points. So I wondered if that was constraining or frustrating. I started out maxed on my obsession. You were close to the bottom on your compulsion. And just wondering how that mechanic felt.
Yeah, the numbers are from 1 to 5. So you started at Obsession 5, and I started at Compulsion 2. And in some ways, those are like your main do your thing stat, right? That is your main investigating stat, and that is my main murder people stat. We had set up this game in advance, and I had texted you, and I said, do you want to play the killer or the detective? And then you said, I want to play the detective. And then I realized that was a good choice because honestly, when you read the rules, setting up a killer is really hard. It's a lot more almost GM prep like, right? Than you would think for a one session, 2 player, no GM game. That section is huge. The guy who wrote the game clearly did a whole bunch of actual research. It talks about how the FBI really categorizes killers, and you make all these choices based on a lot of real psychological theory, at least as much as necessary to make a game work. It does say in the book that most serial killer fiction where we've got these sort of suave, slow burn, genius serial killers, those aren't real. Right? They don't really function that way. And I was far more interested in doing that sort of fictional thing than doing something a little more realistic. It makes it clear that that's if you want to play the like sort of mastermind type serial killer, you're a high control, right, stat. My control stat was almost at max. And yeah, so my compulsion was low. It was never frustrating. It did lead to me doing a lot of tension building scenes. And I liked that. I liked the fact that I wasn't just describing gruesome murder after gruesome murder. I've seen every episode of Criminal Minds. There's usually some graphic that happens at the beginning, and then we're done with the overly graphic stuff. It's all tension from here on out. It's very sensitive to that kind of thing. Narratively, I was more interested in that kind of experience anyways, and that's what that led to. When a serial killer does a murder scene, he will kill somebody. His victim score will go up regardless of the outcome of the die roll. It's more about whether or not there's any evidence left behind. I forgot about the plot point element until we were doing it. That meant that I mostly kept my plot points to spend on dice rolls rather than do the narrative intrusive thing. I did that a lot less, but that didn't bother me. I think for what I wanted out of the game, which was much more the slow burn psychological thriller, I think it worked really well.
Yeah, you didn't have the plot points to jump into my scenes willy-nilly, but I don't think that it was, something your character would have done earlier. It made sense when you did it. I had the plot points available to spend to get into your scenes or to mess with your scenes more. But, I didn't do it very often.
I think the 2 points to like enter a scene if you really want you to meet is really powerful. I know that the idea is that there are certain scenes where you're narrating for yourself and you're just telling a story at that point. Because not only is the character not there, the player is not involved. Right? The player is shut out of those scenes. That it's the other player just monologuing. So I understand if you have something you want to throw in. Hey, here's this mechanic to spend a point. You'll be able to throw in that element. Now I want to ask you a question. What do you think you did particularly well playing this game?
I think I embodied that detective who's driven by an obsession with their job, who doesn't necessarily understand it himself, but finds himself casting aside all of the things that moor them to the world other than trying to find the killer. They're really not good at anything else. And so I think I did that well. And, I liked the character. He wasn't unlikable. He was flawed, but he was a likable kind of guy. I wanted him to succeed. I wanted him to work things out with his family. I felt his pain.
There's this interesting thing where we both have themes for our characters physically written down on this little target thing that we're rolling dice on at the top of scenes. And it's supposed to tell you a theme to sort of incorporate in the scene. And what's interesting is that we can land on each other's themes. Since you're talking about that you liked Finney, that you felt you embodied him well, do you feel like when the dice landed on one of my themes, but it was supposed to be about you, did you find that those things helped enrich and give depth to Finney?
I think ultimately did. That was a little bit of a struggle there. It would land on your thing, and I'm like, wait, that's your thing. It was interesting to have that work its way into my character. I think the mechanic is a good one, actually, because it makes the detective and killer a little more relatable to each other, right? They're not completely different people. When that happens, there's some bleed between the two characters, and the more it happens, the more similar the detective and the killer can be. What makes the characters tick is always important in these stories.
I often feel that serial killer fiction inherits some stuff from the Gothic, and mirroring is a big thing in Gothic. When you said you were embodying Finney, you then also had these extended themes that came from my character. So it was interesting to see you express ideas that my character was bringing to the table from Finney's perspective, or how it expresses itself in Finney's life.
Yeah, and I think it creates parallelism in the two characters' narrative arc. I think the ways that the game makes the narrative dance between the two characters and double back and echo with each other, I think is really powerful.
If you played it again, is there anything you think you would do better?
That's a good question. I might more smoothly incorporate your themes into my story when it came up. There were a couple moments where you roll the dice and you land on a box and you're like, did I really capture that in that scene? It's a jumping off point, but I wonder whether I really embodied that idea in what happened in that scene. What else? So maybe bringing in more of his life in more poignant ways, I think could have been useful.
I think you're right about honoring what constraints there are, because there was also that side chart based on our stats that we're supposed to like limit how the world is presented, and I feel like we both could have maybe stuck to that chart and honored it a little better than we did.
It's hard to do that because some scenes you're doing paperwork and you're like, how do I make paperwork horrific? It's challenging.
It is challenging. I do think where the game has these light constraints rolling on the theme chart and that thing over there that says, what the world is supposed to be like, I definitely think the hardest thing to do in the game is to actually like remember to honor those those things, Um, do you have a favorite memory from this game? Like, is there a standout moment for you?
There were a lot of good moments, actually. I liked when I broke into your house, and then you trip an alarm and I run out the back. I think that was sort of a classic moment. We had the chief trying to pull you off the case moment, so I really enjoyed that. You actually had one of the victims who was actually pursuing you, which I thought was interesting. You didn't have to pursue her. There were a lot of good moments. How about you? What did you find particularly memorable?
I did like the moment where I did confront your family and you spent those 2 plot points to jump in. Those were great. I enjoyed the evidence that you like made up. I feel like one of the things that our game was good at is that when you scored evidence points, we didn't just write down evidence points. Like you said what the evidence was. Oh, I find the tag that says where this came from. Oh, or I call the shop and I get the information. I enjoyed the fact that we both took the time to make all those details. When you were going through my house, like I was just, and then you find this like creepy folder with these like photographs in it, all circled and everything, right? I really enjoyed that we didn't skimp on the texturing.
That's the thing to point out in the mechanics, which was really good, is that once you've spent a plot point to add something to a scene, it's yours. You can bring it up later without spending a plot point, so it recurs naturally. You had a graduation gown on one of the bodies, so then you did up where you're pursuing your next victim, and I show the gown hanging on the hook behind your door. Then I owned that gown, so I could bring it up in various ways. You get that reoccurring MacGuffin, some kind of symbol that takes on meaning because it keeps reappearing, which I found was really strong. That was actually one of my strongest pieces of evidence later.
So just to begin to wrap up a little bit, what are you looking forward to playing next?
Well, I'm in another Blade Runner game. In your game, I played a replicant. In this game, I'm playing the veteran human cop. I'm playing a skimmer, so they're a little corrupt. So that's fun. It has a different flavor when you change your archetype. So I'm looking forward to more of that.
Well, thank you for being one of the people I continue to play with and for chatting with me today. This is your second time. I'm sure it won't be your last.
Thanks, Jesse. Take care.
Thank you for listening to The People I Play With. Please join me in 2 weeks when I interview T about running space mysteries in X Tenebrous.